As quick as I can, kind of along the lines of what Chief Giles talked about, I wanted to share kind of a news article from back in New York. Kind of explains what my job is as the designee of the chief, as the fire code official. It talks about a city inspector inspected a building and the building manager. Fire alarm wasn't up to date. There was issues with the sprinkler system, so they didn't file the right paperwork, didn't take the right steps to remedy it. There was a fire a few months later, 4 people lost their lives. They've now done a 14-count indictment on the building manager and the fire code inspector. And that's what you gentlemen have tasked me with. It's not a popular job to have. I don't get lots of handshakes when I leave places, but this is what we deal with, is if we choose to turn a blind eye to something that we know is an issue. The fire code does state that as an inspector, we're not legally liable unless there's negligence, unless there's turning the other cheek, ignoring issues that we know are an issue. So I just wanted to present that to you. It kind of shows the severity of what can happen. That's what you gentlemen employ me for, is to enforce the fire code. That's a maintenance code that requires that certain things get done over a certain period of time. Alarm systems need to be recertified and checked every year. Hood systems in restaurants have to be every 6 months because it's a continual fire hazard, that's a threat to the public safety. So rather than just get too far into that, please take a read through it, read it, throw it away after you do, whatever, but it just shows that it's not completely unknown to be sued, especially on a 14-count indictment for negligent homicide and second-degree manslaughter. The other item I wanted to discuss is, after the January 18th meeting, there's been a little bit of confusion as far as fire flows of what we require for the fire code and the fire code that we've been tasked to enforce. So I made just another printout of the exact code references for the fire code and even put in the state amendment to the fire code. So prior to, well, up till now, we've allowed 3 options for obtaining fire flow. You can use a local culinary source if you build close enough where you can bring it to you. You can provide fire flow through different NFPA regulations, or the state does allow us to reduce fire flow for isolated 1 and 2 family dwellings. We've allowed that to mean the installation of fire sprinklers. So in those areas, it wasn't necessarily a requirement to install sprinklers, it was an option to satisfy fire code. So you can bring culinary water from the nearest culinary source, you can provide it through tanks and pumps, or we allowed a reduction in the use of fire sprinklers. The state amended in 507 1.1 that you can reduce. Nowhere in the code does it give myself or the fire chief the authority to completely relieve the requirement of fire flow. It doesn't say for a 1 and 2 family dwelling you don't have to have it. You have to have some sort of fire protection. Because I know the chief knows, the battalion chiefs know, every member, 44 members of the fire district know what we need to put out a fire. It's water. Whether that's water from a bucket or water from a fire truck, you have to have fire or water to put out a fire, especially in a rescue situation where you're sending firemen in for a potential rescue with a downed victim. So I don't expect you to read it all now and have any questions, but you all have my cell phone number here every month. If you have any questions, concerns of what's being enforced, like I've said before, I'm not going to enforce anything that I can't back up with code. Granted, there's a lot of interpretation that goes into code, there's a lot of opinions. If there's any question about what we're requiring, I'd be happy to meet with you one-on-one and go over the exact requirement and give a little bit of background, because there's 2 sides to every story, and if I misinterpret something, I'm not proud enough to deny it. And that's pretty much all I have, unless there's any questions I can entertain.
What I have trouble with, then, is determining, you know, it says on a private system you go to NFPA 24 or NFPA 22. What is that? I mean, you read that book?
It's just another code that gives you guidance of what the requirements are, whether it's a static draft site, it's pumps to provide pressure, it's a pond. is just another nationally recognized standard. So that's another thing that the code goes through is, so the intent of the fire code is a reasonable level of life safety for citizens, firefighters, and responding personnel, as recognized by nationally recognized standards. So this gives you what is required, so it's not just Clint saying, well, I want X amount of gallons through this big of a tank.
But as I went through them, I can find nowhere where it defines what a minimum fire flow is.
1142 gives you the minimum volume and the minimum flow rate that it needs to be out
Okay,
of.
that's the size of the improvement.
Based upon the size of the structure, the type of construction, and its proximity to exposures, which would be, I believe it's any building over 100 square feet, but I'd have to check that for sure.
But all of them were higher than what we're doing now.
Yes.
I think our minimum flow is 500 gallons a minute.
No.
We don't.
It's 1,000 GPM. I made a concession in Brighton Estates. The legislature actually passed an ordinance. It was similar to the one you guys done on January 18th. They found out they couldn't legally say 1980, and they had done a 1980 and a 500 GPM for anything that was platted prior to that. Well, it was challenged. They took it out of the code, and the code reads what it is today. In that time frame, I had worked with Brighton Estates, and I drafted a letter that I would accept 500 GPM on those. The SSD that's actually being granted up there is putting them into JSSD specs, which are gunning for 1,500 GPM.
So that's the minimum that we have. The state code that the chief's talking about was a structure up to 5,000 square feet, had to have 500 gallons for 30 minutes. 5 to 10,000 was 750 for 30, and 10,000 and above was 1,000 for 30. So that's what we referenced for the Brighton Estates and what we were allowing for the reduction. Since then, the legislature's taken that out, but I believe it still references that without it being officially adopted in the legislation.
You have a chart that shows the different fire flows for, it's minimum usually 1,000 in residential and 1,500 in commercial, except you had that letter from Brighton Estates. Have you kind of a chart or anything that you follow? Or that you could...
To obtain the fire flow, or of every hydrant in the county?
Well, that's a lot that you're talking about. Yeah, that would be great to have the fire flow in every hydrant in the county. But you guys know where the problem areas are, right? You know which ones flow and which ones don't.
We can have an idea due to head loss and the different pressures.
So other than Brighton Estates, anybody else get an exception? Timberlake's did on this last one because...
No, Timber Lakes hasn't. That's the only letter I drafted, but in Appendices B, the one that was up for a resolution, actually talks about 500 GPM on certain structures in certain areas. But that was never ever adopted, so.
The House Bill 281 capped it at 2,000 when, if you go by the NFPA book, it should be 3,200 on some of them homes.
So NFPA 1142, I believe the max it requires, so I think we're talking, so the House bill you're talking maxed it out at 2,000 gallons per minute for a residential structure. That's 2,000 gallons a minute. NFPA 1142, I believe it maxes out at 1,000 gallons a minute, depending on the size of the structure and the flow rate.
And that's on the wrong table.
It's not an easy equation to calculate, because you have to do every floor, if there's an exposure, and then there's 1.5 times this, plus this, and then however many gallons you need sets the flow rate that it has to be delivered, which would have to be done through elevation or pumps. Which then you throw in pumps, then it's another NFPA code that references another NFPA code, and there's lots of NFPA codes.
I would just caution if you're thinking about adopting that.
They can't figure it out. They keep referring to it as another rock.
And that's, so Your 1142. Your 1142 is water supplies for suburban and rural firefighting. So it talks about how if there's not an approved water supply. So an approved water supply through municipal is 365 year-round. Every day there's water in the tank that is supplied by someone off-site. So there's none of that in the outskirts of Wallsburg, in the Northfields, in anywhere where there's not a municipal water system. The only place it references 1142, I believe, is in Appendix B, saying that if there's no municipal water supply, you may reference NFPA 1142.
Any questions for the fire marshal? Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, is there anything else we need to address tonight? Yes.
Can we say anything?
Yes.
We're going to go up there.
Yeah, come on up, Chuck.
I'm Chuck Zurcher, I'm a planning commissioner. And I just wanted to say the advisory committee idea, I think is a great idea to help the chief, especially in long-term stuff, because as you gentlemen know as well as I do, some of the stuff we're seeing requires some long-term planning. And I just think that's a great idea. That's all I have to say. Thanks.
Thank you. Anybody else? Anything from the board? Saying nothing, we'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So made. Second. You got it.
All in favor? Aye. Thank you.